Action research is different from other types of research because it takes action. So a problem is identified, and based off of that problem, an action is developed and implemented during the study, and after the study, it's analyzed to see how it can be implemented into practice. So there are 5 different phases usually taken during action research. So there's an inquiry where you identify a problem, you conduct a review of current knowledge, so you're going to look at other qualitative studies. You develop a design process, implement the intervention that you've developed, and then you want to assess the impact of that intervention so you can put it into practice or continue further research. This type of research is popular among teachers because they feel that it is a good opportunity to implement very feasible changes in practice. So with other types of research, they may feel like it may not implement that well into actual practice. But with action research, you're able to make that determination during the study.
Teaching is a craft. It's both an art and a science, which is why great teachers always experiment and make tons of mistakes. But how do you know what's actually working? Well, one option is action research. Here you can identify a question, test out a strategy, gather data, and determine if it works. The end result is something dynamic, innovative, and tied directly to your classroom. Action research dissolves the barrier between the participants and the researchers. In other words, the teacher actively participates in the situation while also conducting the research. There are many action research frameworks, but they generally follow a similar process. You start out in phase 1, planning for research. Here you begin with inquiry, where you define a specific research question. It needs to be something that can actually be tested. Next, you conduct a literature review to gain a deeper understanding of the topic. Finally, you move into the design process, where you determine your data methods, consider ethical issues, get the required permissions, create deadlines, and set up the systems. Next, you move into the action phase. This is where you engage in multiple cycles of experimentation and data collection. Your data collection might include qualitative data like observations, artifacts, and interviews, or quantitative data like rubric scores, surveys, or achievement data. Afterward, you move to analysis. You'll often start by organizing the data with charts or graphs and looking for specific trends. You might also discuss it with peers, free write in a journal, or create a cluster map before eventually writing out your results. Finally, you have your conclusion. This is where you share your research with the world and reflect on your own practice. This will ultimately lead to newer questions, and the cycle will continue as you refine your craft as a better, more creative teacher.
Action research can either be quantitative, qualitative, or a mixed method approach. Today we're going to be focusing in on the qualitative methods. Qualitative action research has no set of rules for number and identification of the sample. However, the selection and size must be practical for what you're trying to investigate. So if you're trying to look at the effectiveness of something such as a new program, you're probably going to want to use a broader selection of participants. The participants should also be relevant to what is trying to be studied. They should have knowledge and experience in what is being researched. This is in order to provide the researcher with valid data.
There are 5 different methods to collect data in a qualitative experiment. The first is participation in the setting. This allows the researcher to immerse themselves in the environment and experience it firsthand. It also allows the researcher to see new vantage points about the research that they would have missed otherwise if they were not immersed in the setting. The second kind is direct observation. This is taking consistent detailed notes about relative attributes of a certain situation and observing it directly but without interference or being completely immersed in situations such as participation setting. In-depth interviews are person on person and they usually yield more information a lot quicker. It also makes the participant of the study feel a little bit more important and focused on, so you may get different answers depending on what you use. Also, focus groups are another great way to get a lot of information in a short amount of time. It's a useful tool, but it may also interfere with your answers. You have to be careful whether or not it's appropriate to use focus groups versus in-depth interviews. The last one is analyzing documents, such as historical documents, newspapers, collected data from the government, things like that, to use to get yourself a picture, more of a setting or history of what's going on in your study. Another note about data collection is that a combination of methods can be used. This, depending on what your study is about, you can use different methods such as the participation in the setting and analyzing documents, or also in-depth interviews with participation in the setting. Different combinations like that in order to yield a different picture of what type of results you're trying to get. So once you kind of pick what you want to do, you can also, this will also create different intricate patterns in your results, and you will see different things depending on which type of methods that you use in your settings. And lastly, these methods should fit into the criteria. So basically, what is your goal of your study? What are you trying to accomplish? That will determine what combination or what single method of data collection that you use for your study. Analysis for your study actually does begin in the data collection phase because it starts with your data documentation. So notes taken in the field or recorded during research are actually during that collection phase. So depending on what type of notes or recordings you decide to take, that's going to be your documentation. That also plays into internal and external validity, which you will see later on. Coding and categorizing, once you have collected all of your data and translated it, you can begin to start finding your patterns and your key concepts that you had in mind with what in connection to your hypothesis. And lastly, authentication. So you have to consider what evidence you have, what internal and external factors to do with validity that may affect the study. Is that going to affect how authentic the results are going to be? Is it generalizable? All of those are different things to think about as well with your analysis. And lastly is reporting your findings. You have to represent your data in order to show your patterns and your important findings, or maybe lack thereof, depending on what happens.
Okay, so I found an example of a action research study. This one is titled Development of a Customizable Program for Improving Interprofessional Team Meetings. So the authors wanted to find an effective method for interprofessional meetings when dealing with chronically ill patients. So that would include doctors, nurses, dietitians, anyone who is part of the care team for these types of patients. So the need for this intervention was found through a review of literature, and they found that improvements were needed in the structure, patient-centeredness, and leadership for these types of meetings. And in this study, they used a 4-phase approach. So plan, act and observe, reflect, and revise plan. So this further illustrates the phases that they used during the study. So phase 1, they developed a plan based off of an expert panel. Phase 2 and 3 was the testing of the developed plan, and phase 4, they revised and adjusted the program based off the results from the previous phases. So some of the data used to analyze the plan that was implemented was individual and group interviews, and they also used focus groups. So they gathered this information, and then they used a directed content analysis to analyze the data. And based off of the findings, they were able to create a final program, which you can see here in the chart to the right. And that included a reflection framework, training activities, and toolbox. And these are all the interventions that they found that would be successful for the interprofessional meetings.